Thank you for coming to this webinar. So this is put on by Northeastern Washington State University Extension Forestry, the Restoring the Narrative Wildfires of Eastern Washington. My name is Sean Alexander, and I would like to thank you all for joining me today. I'm the newest addition to the Extension Forestry team. I'll be situated in Colville, and we're going to be serving the Stevens, Pend Oreille, Spokane, and Ferry counties, although those are kind of just our local communities. Between Andy and myself, we're going to be working to really help everybody east of the Cascades. So our goal is in line with the general goal of Extension Forestry, and that's going to be to promote forest stewardship to landowners. And we're going to do this by providing education and the tools necessary for maintaining a healthy and resilient forest. I would like to thank Patrick Schultz for moderating this webinar and assisting me with the delivery. Some quick housekeeping notes. Please remember to change the output in your chat box. Go ahead and switch that to all panelists and attendees. And so that way everyone can see the questions that are asked. And if you prefer to ask questions anonymously, you can use the Q&A function and we will respond. So prior to registration, I asked whether you had any questions for the panelists or myself. We had actually quite a good response with over 20 questions asked. Obviously, we can't get to all of these. So I'll slowly kind of work through and get some responses back to people privately. Some of these will be answered either directly or indirectly in the presentation. And we will include a question Q&A between the speakers. So this webinar will be recorded and it will be hosted on our YouTube page, and I will be putting it on the Northeastern Washington Extension Forestry Facebook page. So keep an eye out. Kevin Zobrist and Brendan White are finishing out their forest stewardship series. They're going to be doing a couple more. I know one of them is going to be on root rot, which I'm super interested in. On August 5th, which this one hasn't really been announced yet, but I'll go ahead and give you guys the early details. We're going to be doing a workshop, a short workshop on early cereal forest habitat and ecological management strategies. And so we're going to be looking at how best to create early cereal habitat, who benefits from it, and where's the right place to do it. And then beginning on August 26th, the Washington Tree Farm program will be kicking off their fall forestry seminars, and they've got three weeks, 3 Wednesdays. They're going to be doing a presentation, and those look all very interesting, so make sure and check those out. So a few weeks ago, Patrick Schultz hosted Dan Donato and Ashley Blazina on Wildfires of Western Washington. Dan highlighted that a majority of this ecosystem did not experience fire on a frequent cycle, but when it did burn, they often burned at a high severity across large areas. The combination of factors to facilitate these large fires would have often been very dry conditions, a drought year, and you really needed a source ignition, which is pretty rare, and you needed a randomly occurring easterly wind pushing towards the East Coast. And this combined to create these very devastating fires. Ashley Blazina followed this up by describing the actions that we can take to become resilient and ready for a large mega fire to occur. While there are several actions that you can take around your house, the best thing you can do is to prepare a plan to evacuate in the occurrence of a fire that is beyond our control. So now my hope is to turn our attention to Eastern Washington. While this portion of the state has a diverse range of plant communities, ranging from the sagebrush steppes to the montane mixtures of subalpine fir and whitebark pine, much of our forests do not support the same level of moisture that our Western Washington counterpart does. And this change in climate lends to an altered forest composition, one that has a lower tree density and a greater composition of grasses and fine fuels. Ultimately, this system experienced a much different fire regime than the dense forest of Western Washington, one that occurred more frequently, often having a low impact or considered low severity, and was highly variable. And while foresters and loggers are working around the clock to mechanically thin our forests and reduce this accumulated fuel buildup, we're still faced with the challenges of limiting catastrophic fires. For example, future thin stands will require subsequent re-entries to control regeneration, which may not always be economically feasible and will rely on current market conditions or future market conditions. However, simply returning fire to the landscape also has its own challenges. So therefore, my hope with this webinar is to continue the education campaign in the hopes of creating a future pyrogenic society, much like the Native American populations before us. One that does not fear the presence of fire, that we prepare our land for the inevitable, and can live mutualistically, with fire as a tool to maintain our dry forest ecosystems. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. We have Dr. Paul Hesburgh and Guy Gifford. Dr. Paul Hesburgh is a landscape ecologist and forester with the U.S. Forest Service, and he's an affiliate professor at the University of Washington, University of Idaho, and Oregon State University. His seminal paper, Dry Forests and Wildland Fires of the Inland Northwest, is the benchmark research on comparing historical forests to modern conditions for our region. And he was a speaker for the TED series, Living Dangerously in the Era of Megafires. Guy Gifford is the Northeastern Region Landowner Assistance Forester and Fire Prevention Coordinator. He covers over 1.2 million acres of forest land, working with over 40,000 potentially 40,000 family forest owners. He's worked extensively with WSU Extension, including the forestry and master gardener programs, to develop curriculum, speak at community events, and he's been a wildland firefighter since 1984, starting on a 20-person crew. He started his forestry career with the DNR in '91 in Deer Park and has worked in the Deer Park area ever since. So with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul Hesburgh. Again, we're going to have a question and answer session shortly, 10 minutes in between, and then Guy Gifford will take over from there. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on your webinar series. As Sean indicated, I'm a research landscape ecologist, and over the last 4 decades, I've been studying Western forests, in particular, how they've changed over the period of settlement and management, and what that means for processes like wildfires and insect and pathogen disturbance regimes, how they're changed as a consequence of those changes. Tonight, I'm going to contrast conditions in the early 20th and 21st centuries, and I'm going to focus my attention on Eastern Washington. My talk tonight is not about how we suppress fire, bad fire years, when direct attack and indirect attack are advised. Instead, I want to focus my attention on looking at historical fire regimes, how they influenced forest succession, and how forest succession actually was a feedback to fire regimes. I'm going to look at how management alters those fire regimes. Fire regimes are the extent, the frequency, the severity, and the seasonality of fire. I'm going to look at how management affects the fire regimes, the structure and composition of forests, and the patterns of forest, which we're finding out are really important to how fire works on that landscape. Management changed the functioning of landscapes in Eastern Washington at patch or stand levels all the way to the level of the regional landscape, and I'm going to talk about that. Then I'm going to layer in climate warming and show that we're entering a period of large fires. They're going to get bigger, and these fires are interacting with dense, highly layered forests, and initial attack is failing, of course, about 2% of the time under these hot, dry, and often windy summer fire season conditions. And then I'll end with some management implications of these changes and recommend half a dozen different principles that we can use going forward to restore more fire resilient and climate adapted conditions. I want to start by showing you Oregon and Washington and how the historical fire frequency and severity they're zoned geographically. And these are areas of vegetation and climate differences. And you can see the rain shadow pretty boldly right here in Oregon and Washington. And you can see how the fire regimes get drier, the fires get much more frequent. You can see we have high frequency, 1 to 35 years, all the way to 200 to 1200 year frequency, where fires are infrequent as a consequence of really moist to wet conditions, long growing seasons, and really productive forests. So we're going to talk about conditions east of the rain shadow in our neck of the woods, Eastern Washington. First, I want to talk about sort of the bookend fire regimes. The first is the low severity fire regime. These are These are associated with dry pine and dry mixed conifer forests, forests with pine, Douglas fir and grand fir on the driest sites. And historical fire, like you can see in this top bar graph here, most of them were low or moderate severity. And when they were moderate, surface fire effects tended to dominate. Low severity means less than 20% of the dominant tree cover or basal area is killed by each instance of fire. So we saw these in dry pine and mixed conifer forests. They occurred on ridge tops and dry aspects like south-facing aspects. And they were frequent, and that caused them to be low severity because fire was consuming fuels, consuming fuel ladders every 5 to 25 years, constantly reducing fuels, keeping the fuels light and patchy. And this high frequency reinforced low severity fires most of the time in the future, and extreme climatic conditions drove more extreme fires. And so you see there's a lower amount of moderate and high severity fire, if you can see my cursor. Today, keeping fire out of the woods and missing lots of fires, we've reduced the likelihood of low severity fires. As you can see in this lower bar graph, moderate severity fires with quite severe impacts and high severity fires are what we look at in those systems today. The other bookend is these high severity fires. These are fires where more than 70% of the tree cover or basal area is killed by fire. And these high severity fires occur in different patch size, and they leave landscapes like you see in the bottom black and white panel. These are common in wet and cold forests where fires are infrequent. So this is sort of the right bookend on fire regimes. Let's say fires every 150 to 300, even up to 1,000 years. Most fires, as you can see in this barcode here, were high severity, but actually milder conditions would favor low and moderate severity fires on the landscape. And these fires, low, moderate, and high, created considerable variation in fire event patch sizes, what we like to call patch size distributions. I'll show you an example. And then variation in fire severity, which led to variation in successional conditions, keeping fire out of the woods. This is what the current variability of the fire regime and high severity regimes of wet and cold forests looks like today. And then we've got this really mixed up bin in the middle we call mixed or moderate severity fire. It includes everything from 20 to 70% of the tree cover or dominant basal area killed at each instance of fire. And we saw these in some of the dry and moist mixed conifer forests where pine and western larch mingle with Douglas fir, grand fir, sometimes subalpine fir, Doug fir, and lodgepole pine. Fires occurred with intermediate frequency every 30 to 50 years, so fuels had a chance to accumulate, and some patches had heavy fuels. And so you would see mostly these moderate or mixed severity fires here, but more severe climate would allow high severity fire, less severe, actually low severity fire in these conditions. This is looking at Beehive nearby and a historical picture of a mixed severity fire regime. One of the things about keeping fire out of the woods for a century or more, remember that fire suppression really starts with domestic livestock grazing in the latter part of the 1800s, and then the end of cultural burning at 1850, which in many places was quite significant. In the pre-suppression era, these blue bars, you see that most of the fires were really quite small. 10 acres, 100 acres, 1,000 acres. So the big counts were right here, and very low counts of these higher severity fires. But an awful lot of the landscape was actually burned by this low count. With suppression, the fires burning under low and moderate fire weather are being easily doused. And so the ones that are escaping initial attack are mostly, so you can see this reduction in the small fires. And you can see a really significant increase in these larger fires, which are burning the lion's share of the landscape. I want to talk about two really important landscape ideas that are really important. The fire on fire and wildfire patterns of old, they provided positive feedback and a natural resilience mechanism. So these ongoing fires maintained a patchwork of burn and recovering for successional conditions in a variety of high and low fuel conditions and serial stages or age classes and patch sizes and degrees of openness. And these patchworks, they spatially interrupted the conditions that supported the flow of large fires. So the ongoing fires over space and time basically repelled some fires and allowed others to be lower and moderate severity. And so that influenced the fire regime, frequency, size, and severity going forward. And then insect disease and weather disturbances added to this complexity. And occasionally you would see extreme weather events that were driven by really persistent droughts, often accompanied by extreme fire weather. They would override or trump these spatial controls. There's important stand or patch level feedbacks too. These frequent low and moderate severity fires, on the other hand, they reinforced resilience by reducing the dead wood on the ground and the fuel ladders that led to the crowns of big trees. They increased the height to live crowns, so they elevated the base of live crowns, and they decreased crown density. And a little thought experiment will let you know why that's really important. Imagine standing over a campfire with a big golf umbrella and the heat that would trap in that umbrella. Now imagine taking 50% of that cloth away and opening holes, and you'd see how that heat energy would dissipate through the umbrella. Crown density is a key feature. Frequent fires also favored early cereal species like ponderosa pine, western larch, sugar pine, western white pine, things like that. And it favored medium and large-sized trees. They had the right foliage geometry, they had thicker bark, and they tended to survive most fires. So these were common features of these stands, and they created a feedback for more of the same kind of fire. And finally, these fires favored patchy tree and surface fuel cover. So it was difficult for a fire to get ahead of steam and keep rolling, because you'd see the fire flare up and you'd see some passive and active torching, and then you'd see the fire go back to the ground, move through patchy surface fuels, and so on. I want to show a couple drawings by a colleague of mine, Bob Van Pelt, who really illustrate this cool idea. So here's how the feedbacks at a stand level work. You can see, sorry about that, you can see at time zero an open stand condition where a lot of the trees are fairly good size, and then you see seed saps and small poles regenerate, filling in some of those gaps. In the next 10 or 20 years, along comes a fire, and you can see surface fuels get consumed, some scarring of trees, some fuel ladders get consumed. This is the resulting condition. Looks kind of like the previous condition before the fire. And then the next 10 or 12 years, you see another fire like that will come along, torch out a new bunch of trees, again, deal with the surface fuels. And you see these kinds of conditions continue to roll along. And this gave you continuous tree regeneration. So if you'd go and age in a 100-acre patch, the ponderosa pine and some Douglas fir that occurred there, you'd see many different age classes repeatedly regenerating in small clumps and patches on that landscape. Then you take fire out of the woods for 80 plus years, and what you see is all that regeneration that was being tended and removed by fires, essentially accumulating and producing a continuous multi-layered canopy. And that's what taking surface fires and clumpy, gappy, moderate severity fires out of the woods did. And so we can get clues from how we can manage our landscape to change the fire behavior from these frequent fire dynamics. So just to underscore a couple ideas, locally, fires continually thin patches and reduce density and surface fuels. And then regionally, fires created these variable patchworks of grass, shrub, early, mid, and late cereal conditions. Those are, new forest, immature, mature, and old conditions. And these patterns spatially controlled future fire size and severity. So from that, we learned also that heterogeneity in open and closed canopy conditions and the amount of fuel on the ground is really important to change the flow of fire, and especially the length of flames on the landscape. All right, I want to show some pictures that a colleague of mine, John Marshall, has been photographing. These are from 1930s panoramas. This is at Lookout Mountain in the top photo near Twisp. 1930s, that photo, and you can see basically a grassland-dominated landscape with lenses of trees on the north-facing aspects. And you can see in 2011, rephotographed, how it flipped from a grass-dominated landscape to a tree-dominated landscape, with many of those grassy areas filling in now with pine and Douglas fir. Here's an example from the Mazama area. This is Leecher Mountain. In the top photo, 1930, you can see very open ground conditions, filled in 2011. Carlton Complex cooked out much of that landscape in 2015 in the lower photo. And I wanted to beam in and show you just what that openness looked like in 1930. A lot of grassy understories, open grass balds on that landscape. 2011, you can see how that's really filled in. So now we've changed the way fire can work on that landscape. In 2015, you see that result in, instead of having surface fires thinning out, reducing dead wood, we have a lot more crowning fire on that landscape. This is out my back door. This is Mission Peak in 1934 on top. And you can see there was a lot of topographic alignment. The dry south slopes and ridges were really open. Oftentimes they're either sparse woodlands or open conditions. 2010, keep fire out of the woods, and you can see a lot of those conditions have filled in with trees. And if you're looking carefully at it, you can see bark beetle and western spruce budworm defoliation on some of those drier sites. This is cold forests up in the Slate Peak area. Slate Peak is 16 miles northwest of Mazama. These are lodgepole pine and mixes with subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. And you can see that landscape saw a lot of fire. An awful lot of areas that are recently burned in shrub fields, not yet regenerated. Roll the film and you look at the photo on the bottom, 2013, and you can see an awful lot more of that landscape is filled in. This is Bethel Ridge. It's an area of moist mixed conifer and cold forest. You can see, as far as the eye can see, a lot of patchiness of fire. 1936, roll the film, 2012. You can see that landscape is monotonous, it's densely treed. Mountain pine beetle and Douglas fir beetle are causing extensive mortality. You can imagine this area, it's east of Mount Rainier, which you can see clearly there, and it's west of Natchez, near Rimrock Lake. All right, I want to talk about some of the change agents that got us here. And the list on the left are the things that sort of work together to create these conditions, and the changes on the right are what came with those agents. So roads and railroads, if you stop and think about them, they created vast fuel break network. They weren't built as that, but there are tens of thousands of miles, and there are more roads on national forest system lands in the United States than there are in the US highway system. So lots of roads. We subdivided the landscape by ownership. We didn't know that that would fragment forests by the varied management goals, the timing, those sorts of things. Timber harvest, both clear cutting and selection cutting, fragmented the moist forest and it cut the old forest. And when we removed the pine, the big Doug fir, and the larch, we left behind the small immature Doug fir, grand fir, and white fir. And this is what created the increased vulnerability to fires through fuel ladders. And it also increased vulnerability to a variety of insects and diseases. Fire prevention and suppression were important as well for removing those thinning effects. And it resulted in an epidemic of trees, which I'll show you in a second. The removal of a lot of the native grasslands and the development of agriculture reduced essentially a fire distribution system that was really important, and that aided in excluding fires. You add to that climate change, we're getting larger and more severe fires, and that trend is continuing. Here's some reconstructions from early to late 20th century. The map on the left is of cover types. You can see ponderosa pine in the light green and herbland in the blonde, and the dark brown shrubland dominated an awful lot of that landscape. And you see great variety in patch sizes on that landscape. And things like grand fir and Douglas fir do not dominate. 80 years later, you can see that Douglas fir and grand fir cover types have replaced the pine and grass and shrubland cover types. This is what happens structurally with that landscape. Great variety in structural conditions. Stand initiation, stem exclusion, open and closed canopy conditions, understory reinitiation, young multi-story forest, old multi-story forest, and old park-like stands. Old single-story, great variety, basically became young multi-story forest. A lot of density, a lot of layering, a lot of fuel ladders. So cover and structure both really increased, and an all-age open and closed mosaic was replaced by basically a closed canopy mosaic. And these changes in structure and composition are extensible to changes in things like the loading of fuels, the crown fire potential, and the flame lengths expected under a wildfire scenario. And all I really want you to see is hot colors, severe, cool colors not, and just notice in the historical rack that the structure is highly influential on fuel loading, crown fire potential, and flame length. And you see the same is true with those transitions. You see that the likelihood of high fuel loading, high crown fire initiation and spread, and long flame lengths that repel direct attack are now associated with those changes. Not only did forest conditions change for wildfires, but you can also see that they change for insects that are native to these forests, but now acting some of the time in non-native ways. So in this map, you can see the distribution of western spruce budworm in the western US and Canada. And this is the culprit right here. And you can see that historical forests were vulnerable to western spruce budworm. But what's changed is that vulnerable patches are more often next to other vulnerable patches. And so we see outbreaks moving across the landscape and sometimes being chronic under the right vegetation and climatic conditions. The mountain pine beetle, just one example. There are many host specialized beetle. Here you can see the native range of this beetle. It belongs here. It makes a living under natural conditions. And it's really not that big. Here's what the gallery looks like. Here's what the pitch tubes look like on an attacked tree. And here's what the damage looks like. And you can see that at any one time there would be dispersed vulnerability to mountain pine beetle attack, but now it's become quite contagious on the landscape. So we'll see outbreaks move from patch to patch, and like the top photo shows, creating quite a bit of widespread mortality. I'm going to close off my talk with some 7 principles that we wrote about a couple years back. If you're interested in further reading, this is the article, and it'll be in the PDF of my talk if you're interested in taking a peek at it. These are the 7 principles. What we've learned in our landscape studies is 7 things that we think are pretty cool and pretty important. The first of them is that our landscapes aren't just one landscape, but there's several levels of landscape that nest inside of each other. And for illustration, this is the Blue Mountains province. You can see it here. And I'm going to beam into one particular area, and so we can look at this particular watershed, and you can see that you have patterns within patterns within patterns within patterns. And these levels of organization, they actually matter to the fire resilience of the landscape. So here you can see that grasslands, shrublands, and forests interdigitate. They intermingle across the landscape. And what we're finding out in our modeling is that these grasslands and shrublands were quite extensive historically, and they were a fire delivery system. So if you have expanded area of forest and reduced area of grassland and shrubland, you're increasing the area where crown fire potential might be more likely. And that is contributed at several scales of observation. Here in this lower left panel, you might see spatial patterns of open closed canopy, different cover types. If you move into a particular patch, which we show up here close up, you can see that there are patterns of clumped and gapped trees within the landscape, and they all work together to influence how insects, pathogens, and fire will work a landscape. The second principle is that topography and soils, they provide a natural template for vegetation and habitat patterns. Here's a map we made in the GIS that shows ridge and valley topographies and then north and south aspects colorized. And what we see is these conditions are different environments for productivity, growing season length, seasonal moisture, water deficit, and the like. And that's expressed through the interaction between the vegetation that grows there and the frequency of fire and other disturbances that happen. So we can actually take the current conditions, use a template, something like this, to fit more characteristic patterns back to the landscape. Fire and forest succession and climate, those interactions are the engines that drive the system. And if we restore the fire regime and the patterns that support it successionally, so open versus closed, age classes, successional conditions, this will influence how the fire regime acts going forward, and the climate will continue to tune that, but not as aggressively as we're seeing it right now. These patch size distributions of forest successional conditions are really important. They actually emerge from these linked climate disturbance topography interactions, and so they actually reinforce how fire will flow on the landscape. If you have very large patches that are burned and very large patches that are regenerated, that influences species composition, the aging of the forest conditions, and how homogeneous disturbances will also work. So restoring these size distributions is a clever move going forward to adapt the climate and disturbance regimes going forward. We find that widely distributed medium and large-sized trees provide a critical backbone to these landscapes. They store genes really well for species that are adapted to the landscape, and they're really adapted to this frequent to moderately frequent fire regime. And so growing and cultivating these and having rotation lengths that allow us to be able to work with larger size classes, thicker bark trees, is also helpful to working with that fire regime. From some of Derek Churchill and Andrew Larson and Jamie Leiterson's work, we recognize that stands or successional patches are really landscapes within the landscape. In the mixed conifer and pine patches, what we see is clumpy trees in different size clumps, and then we see gaps, and different size gaps as being really important to how fire acts within a patch on that particular landscape. If you have open canopy, you have low crown bulk density, and so running crown fires are difficult. They're interrupted by canopy breaks. It also leads to patchy fuels across the landscape, so you don't have big, deep, dead woody deposits to carry fire. So these, and especially in the mixed conifer and pine conditions, and there's some new data even by Miles Lefebvre from our lab for some of the Colville National Forest conditions that show that throughout eastern Washington, these are important conditions to perpetuate on the landscape instead of evenly spaced, densely stocked stands. Finally, landscape ownership, allocation, management, and access patterns disrupt landscape and ecosystem patterns. As I said before, the landscape is sliced and diced by ownership, and it's difficult to get together and figure out how we're going to work in common to move the needle on the things we want to change. Nonetheless, it makes sense to work collaboratively across these ownerships to develop projects that change the way fire works in the woods. And with expanded good neighbor authorities, we see that being more and more realistic all the time. All right, in sum, we live in landscapes that are shaped by fire. Fire is coming to these woods. Large areas are going to continue to burn. In fact, some burned areas are going to continue to get larger. That's what the climate's doing. But we can influence how severe and how often, but not how large. Fire suppression and exclusion created the high fuel loads we see today, and they created a fire deficit, which is changing right now as a result of these big crown fires. Climate is going to allow wildfires to burn hotter and larger than most historical fires unless we actually get a hand on the surface and canopy fuels. Extreme weather is continually increasing fire size and severity in most types. And the Achilles heel to the problem is dealing with the fuels and adapting the landscapes for these warming landscapes. I think the 7 principles that I talked about here can actually guide an awful lot of their work. And I think at this time, I will make some time for questions. This is also another a research brief done by the Northwest Fire Science Consortium that's got some really cool facts that they're available online. All right, with that, do we have time for some questions?
Yes, we do. The chat has been rather quiet, which is unusual for a webinar. If you guys have any questions, feel free to throw them in. We did get quite a few beforehand, so I have one written out here. I got a couple, but we'll start with one. Can you speak to any ecosystems that wouldn't commonly have fire in it in the east side, or fire refugiums in the most wet sites?
We find fire refugia in all forest types, as it turns out. And fire refugia, what we're finding out is that these are places that, even though fire in the neighborhood is frequent, these are places by virtue of aspect conditions, association with streams or stream confluences. They escape fire more than the surrounding landscape. And what we're finding out is they not only are modelable, I can give you some references for the work on that, but the context, what's wrapped around them, what surrounds them is also really important. So even Meg Krawchuk has done some really cool work on cold forests in British Columbia, and she's extending that work now to Oregon and Washington. And we're basically finding that how fires burn on the surrounding landscape and then certain topographic settings allow you to get more hang time for certain patches of forest. And that's a really important idea if in fact you want to be able to have seed dispersal distances help to regenerate that forest. So.
Thanks, Paul. Can you speak at all to the historical Native American burning and kind of when we saw that tail off?
Yeah, so all across the United States, I can refer you to a text by Omer Stewart. It's called Forgotten Fires. It's a really cool book. And Omer talks about the different forest types throughout the United States and the cultural traditions and the tribes that were using fire. And it's an incredible read, frankly, to learn of the literally hundreds of uses of fire in food production and in making war and in hunting and clearing brush so they could have sighting distances for safety around their encampments. In the West, we're still learning a lot about where that burning happened, and we're learning that by working with some of the tribes in each of the vicinities, and they're sharing their cultural information, not only about traditional burning practices, but what they were for. There's a number of ethnobotany books that are available for the tribes that inhabited Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon. And there's really spectacular reads on not only what sustained them, but where you'd find those things, which gives you sort of a mental map of the many areas where they would actually forage for food. Near encampments and in trails where they were going to for salmon fishing or for bison or elk hunting, that sort of thing. So it's an area of study that's just exploding right now, and we're finding it was quite extensive throughout Eastern Washington, and we're learning even more than we thought.
Great. So a couple questions in the chat came through. It looks like a lot of them will kind of be brought up throughout Guy Gifford's presentation, so I'll save those for him. Olga Mill asked a question: do forest roads help prevent fire spread? And I think you alluded to this in your presentation when you talked about one of the factors that kind of homogenized fires and what ultimately led to suppression. Can you speak to what we see in current days, maybe factors that would negate forest roads, or if we're doing anything in the future to change that structure?
Yeah, you bet. So it's a really great question. So roads were far more effective historically than they are today. We use roads like crazy when we have opportunities for direct attack, and we can do some back burning and burnout operations when the fire weather abates a bit, so that we can actually build a fairly deep black line to flank a fire. During days when direct attack is impossible, those are days when mid-flame wind speeds are pretty significant, and oftentimes a road is not enough to stop the ember attack on adjacent patches. So when fire was common and fuels were lower, roads were highly effective when they were crisscrossing the woods. Now that we have more active crown fire and more days where we have higher winds and drier fuel conditions, we see, and we just wrote a paper on this that I can share if there's interest, where we actually looked at all the California wildfires from 1950 to the current day, and we looked at how topography and roads constrain fire growth, and roads are far less effective than they used to be.
Thank you. All right, well, there's a couple other questions that came in, but I think we're gonna go ahead and get rolling to Guy Gifford. Make sure we get through all the presentations, and we will have some questions at the end. And always feel free to send some questions to me, and I can get answers from our speakers.
Again, my name is Guy Gifford. I work here at Spokane County, and we're going to talk about protecting your home and property from wildfire. And we'll touch on some of the same concepts Paul talked about, because some of those gaps and patches he talked about actually apply around your home, and trying to mimic it on a much smaller scale to help protect your property from the next wildfire. The front picture there, just me and my son 5 years ago. My son was fighting fires for 4 years in college, and so I just kind of like to be a boastful dad and share a picture. Okay, let's see here. There we go. So we do have a lot of wildfires in Eastern Washington, and we do get a lot of homes near homes. And that big aircraft there is not as close to the ground as it looks. A little optical illusion there. It's much higher off the ground than it looks from this picture. But we do use a lot of large aircraft in the county. One of the things that they talk about wildfire in the area, protecting your home, and just the role of fire in our ecosystem is, I always like to give a little thing on fire stats. These are in Eastern Washington. And I'm about to ask a question when I'm doing a presentation, not via Zoom, but what's the leading cause of wildfire? And one of the common answers is, it's humans. We're 81% of the cause in Eastern Washington. Statewide, it's 90% human, but in Eastern Washington, we do have a lot of lightning starts. So this is kind of a stat just for Eastern Washington. But when I ask about human causes, people like to say children. Guess what? Children is only 2% of our human causes. That means 98% of human caused fires are done by adults. That's us. So I like to bring that home to people. The problem is us adults. Another common cause I hear is smoking, and actually smoking is very, very small. Now it's even less in children. The leading cause of human-started fires is actually outdoor burning. And this is people burning on their property. This does not include campfires. Campfires come into recreation. This is typically a homeowner doing stuff around their property. And so that's actually the leading cause of wildfires in Eastern Washington, just homeowners cleaning up, doing some outdoor burning around their property. So as we talk about homes, what we call the wildland urban interface, or WUI, this is just some stats in Spokane County on years that we've lost homes. Eastern Washington, we lose homes on a regular basis. And in Spokane County, we lose structures every year, a lot of outbuildings. And for Eastern Washington, that's the new norm. Losing outbuildings is now the new norm for the area. And structural loss is very common now on an annual basis versus 20 plus years ago. And in this photos, someone who lost a home, and we call the Yale fire in 2016. Very devastating for this homeowner. That same time, we had another fire called the Wellesley fire, and this home survived. fires. We'll talk about some things, steps that homeowners can do to help protect the home from fires. But this homeowner here didn't come out perfectly free from the fire. He did have some damage. This is his vinyl siding. He had about $20,000 of siding damage to his structure. And so that, I consider that fairly successful, because one of the goals I have for people when working in the wild and urban interface in the woods is when bad things happen to you, your recovery back to normal will be quicker than if you had taken no action. And that homeowner in Wellesley had taken quite a few steps to help his property survive, and so his recovery to normal was much quicker. He didn't have to move out of his house. He only had $20,000 of damage. Didn't have to replace everything in the house. So it was very quick for him to get back to normal. So a couple of our objectives for this thing is for recognizing you, homeowners, recognize how your home may ignite during the next wildfire. Know a couple of tasks you can do to reduce your home from starting from an ember. Know some preferred tree species. Paul alluded to those with those cereal species that you can leave in your forest. And we're going to talk about some pruning and tree thinning techniques to maybe restore some of those patches and gaps that Paul was talking about that was there before fire suppression. One of the first things I like to ask people about when you start thinking about the steps is what's your goals for your property? Why do you live where you did? Some people tell me, hey, fire is my number one goal. If fire is your number one goal, the solution is easy. You get rid of all the trees. But people like you don't live in the woods to get rid of all the trees. So you are going to have risk. And so this is when people realize, well, fire is not my number one goal. I also may want to like wildlife. That's often a popular goal. I also want a healthy forest. I may have other goals with my property, whether it's privacy or other things. So having your goals written down and prioritizing what's the most important for you will help you better figure out what to do around your house so that you're more prepared for the next wildfire. And a couple things when we look at house loss. This is called the Swiss cheese model of disaster, of when bad things happen. And each of those pieces of cheese has holes in it. And when they're all in alignment and you have a hazard, you get a major accident. But in protecting homes from wildfire, we have a lot of slices of that cheese that try to stop that line going through all the holes, whether it's prevention, putting restrictions on chainsaws, burn bans, good detection systems. Mitigation is what a lot of homeowners can do around the home to mitigate fire in the area, and also emergency response. And as Paul alluded to on that stat, which is very common, is about 2% of our wildfires escape what we call that initial response, initial attack, become a large fire. When all these things are in alignment with a whole, that's when we get catastrophic incidents happening, or something bad may happen to your property, losing an outbuilding, losing structures, or losing your favorite trees. One thing I like to do as I work with homeowners is what I call the hot zone exercise. Try to figure out where's my priority area I should begin work. And in fire behavior, what we look at, what makes fire big is the topography, the weather, and the field loading. So with that exercise, I got a question is we're gonna try to highlight the heavy fuels around this structure. I think you guys can all agree, looking at this picture. Yeah, that looks like the heavy fuels, what I just showed you there. The next thing I always ask is, do you have any steep slopes around your structure? On this house, it's the south side of the house, has some steep slopes. Fire goes uphill quicker up steep slopes. The last question I always ask is, where does your, and I'm very specific with this, where does your afternoon, summertime wind come from? For this house, it comes out of the southwest. The more of these circles you have overlapping, we call that synergy, the faster and the hotter the fire will be coming at your house. So as I look at this homeowner, one of the things I'd recommend to them is you need to start your priority work on that southwest of that house where you've got all those circles. And you may want to do extra things on that side of the house because you've got really good synergy for that fire. So that's kind of your priority area. Now, as we start looking at the house on how your house may ignite, or we call that heat transfer. We're going to go back to high school basically here and talk about how heat transfers to ignite something around your house or your house itself. One of the key things is things get ignited by what we call conduction heat, molecule to molecule transportation of heat. You grabbing that hot skillet saying ow, or your flames hitting the marshmallow here and burning the marshmallow. The other way things start on fire, that radiant heat. That's the heat you feel around the campfire. If you had a piece of paper, you move it closer and closer to that campfire, eventually it will probably spontaneously ignite. The last thing is heat rises. We call that convection heat. And how it affects us around structures is when that heat rises in large fires, like this fire, it brings what we call embers. And those embers can drop ahead of the fire, which may ignite things around your home. So one thing, so that's kind of how heat transfers. We're going to talk about what we call the home ignition zone around your home. That's what we call defendable space. And we're going to talk about 3 zones briefly. Zone 1, the immediate zone, the house plus 5 feet. Zone 2, we call it lean, clean, and green. And that's your yard and garden. And the last thing is the unimproved property. That's your forest land where we're going to try to reduce the intensity. This is a common picture you see about wildfire, of homes being lost. These big, big, huge flames coming down, burning the house. But the research has shown over half our homes aren't lost by big flames. They're actually started by these tiny little embers from that convection heat rising. And they drop these embers around your home and ignite something around your home. This is a picture of a house that wasn't ignited by flames, but by embers. If you notice, it's all green around the house, except some of the trees are orangish color or slightly off color next to the house because they got exposed to heat because the house started on fire from an ember. Embers can travel over a mile from a wildfire. So that's why one of the first things we look at is how to protect your home from this ember shower. This is, so we call that be ember aware. And this picture just shows you what an ember shower may look like. That was in Wenatchee about 5 or 6 years ago, that high ember showers just throwing embers everywhere around structures. And so we're looking at things that an ember could start on your house plus that first 5 feet. You want to be close to 0 chance of embers starting something on fire in that zone. The first thing we do is look at the roof. What's your roof material? Some type of tile, composite's a great choice. Wooden roofs aren't good, and keeping your roof maintained is one of those key things, keeping it free of debris. Another way embers can get your house, believe it or not, is vents. Remember that slide showing those embers going sideways? Embers can get in these vents and start things on fires. Keeping those vents closed, like in that greenhouse during the summertime, would be nice, or making sure you have some screening behind the vent, like an 1/8-inch mesh is recommended to minimize embers getting in. And as we look around your house on what embers can land on, you also want to look at your outdoor furniture. Would be easily ignitable from an ember. A lot of furnitures are built with fire-resistant material, some aren't, so a lot depends on the age and condition of the material. And of course, cardboard boxes, recycling bins, those things can easily catch things on fire. So looking for those burnable materials outside, I also use the example, a single match could start something on fire. One of the things I often recommend to people is before they go on vacation in the summer or before they're leaving, is they do a check before you leave. Walk around your house and see what things could an ember start on fire. I kind of like to use this picture of how little things can catch us. This is what I call a Mother's Day planter, something we, as a husband, I give to my wife, I give to my mom for Mother's Day, and they're beautiful looking in May. Oftentimes, come August, they look like this. And these things, and the ember can land on it and start it on fire. And here, start this plant on fire. And a lot of that dirt, it's not dirt inside of these planters, it's peat moss, coconut shells. And so it can easily ignite fire, start the deck on fire. One of those interesting things, I work with fire districts a lot. They tell me that they actually get a fair amount of house fires started from these planters because people put the cigarettes out of them. They're dead, they put the cigarettes out and think it's dirt, starts on fire and catches stuff on fire. So these are the little things around your house in that first zone that we look for, that anything can start an ember on fire. So we're looking at that first 5 feet of being no burn, nothing can burn or as close to that as you can tolerate. Whether it's stand, yard, green shrubs are okay, as long as you keep it maintained. Best to have nothing next to the house, but if you need to, make sure they're green. This is an example of what we call burnable mulch. I call it beauty bark, how it started on fire. Luckily, this homeowner didn't lose anything, but the potential was there of it starting on fire. So this beauty bark or that burnable mulch shouldn't be in that first 5 feet zone around your house. And the other thing about houses, think about your outbuildings. This is a picture of actually a shop. A lot of people don't do things around their garages or their outbuildings. And I kind of ask the question, is that enough material to start the house on fire or that outbuilding? I'm not going to answer it. You'll have to think about it because it'll depend on the time of year. If it's August, maybe. June, probably not. So it's one of the things to be aware of looking at what's around my outbuildings as well. This is just an excellent example of great landscaping in that first zone 1. That rock, very little vegetation there, green grass, low chance of things starting on an ember catching on fire. And so this zone 1 is really focusing on that convection heat transfer. Fire rising embers up in the air and dropping around your house over a mile away. And then we call that be ember aware. And I got a short video to really emphasize this point that was research video done to show that example for you.
From start to finish, we're going to start with our ember generators, which we use to recreate a realistic ember exposure. Embers are those small burning and smoldering particles that may travel ahead of the fire front. And what we do with our generators is we create the realistic exposure, and in our wind tunnel, we're able to throw them at a building. And then we have a building that has 2 sides to it, a good side, which uses wildfire-resistant construction, and what we're considering in a typical building that we would see in a wildfire-prone area. Exactly as we expected, that mulch on the ground there caught fire from the embers. The fire from the mulch burned up under this deck, and this whole deck was on fire. And so this fire on this deck caused flames right against the home. And then if we look there at the base of the door, there was actually the flames from this deck that burned through the bottom of the door, and on the inside of the house we started to see smoke and flames. And so because this deck was a combustible material attached to the building, when the embers led to the ignition of this deck, we got flames inside of the building. Here we are on the wildfire resistant side of the house, where we had non-combustible siding, a 5-foot non-combustible zone and 6-inch gap. We had a metal gutter and multi-pane windows, and we see in comparison to the non-wildfire resistant side, this side had the same ember exposure. If you look here in the mulch, you can actually see some of the embers that had accumulated, but because they had no susceptible fuel to ignite, they just landed there and fizzled out. Now here where we have ornamental vegetation, that again is susceptible to the embers, but because it's more than 5 feet away from the home, it didn't have enough energy to ignite, and it never led to a flame impact on the building.
One of the things I liked about the video is it's kind of showing an ember starting some small mulch, and I kind of like to use the campfire scenario. When you're starting a campfire, you need tinder, and that's that fine mulch that a single match can ignite, or a single ember. And that tinder or that mulch next started what we call kindling, and that was that little deck space catching that on fire. And as that kindling started going, it was starting what in a campfire scenario we'd call that log, or in this place it was the house. We kind of had those that tinder, the kindling, and the house there, and so that ember could start that tinder, start that kindling over the deck on fire, and then start the house on fire. Kind of had that chain reaction going there. But kind of shows the importance of this zone, and just doing work in this zone will reduce half our house loss in the wild and urban interface. So we're going to go zone 2, and that's we call the intermediate zone, or 5 to 30 feet away from the structure, a minimum. This may need to be larger if you're on that very hot side of the house, and this is just your yard and garden. And what this zone is trying to do is protect your home from what we call that radiant heat. When these trees go burning up, they produce what I call it radiant heat. And one of the things I like to do is show this quick video we have in our fire behavior class that shows you how long that heat lasts. It's a lot shorter than people think. Yeah, one more. And look at the timeline. This is 3:10:40, and this is real time. And they have sensors in this forest measuring the temperature. And let's see how quickly. There's no sound with this video, so you can see some heat transfer happening here. Some steam coming with the branches. You can see the temperatures in centigrade starting to spike, and you can see some spot fires starting. All of a sudden, we get spontaneous ignition of trees from that radiant heat. We're only 25 seconds into this. About 30 seconds, our temperatures have already started topping out. "37 seconds or so, we already peaked out our temperatures. The biggest flames have already happened. About a minute into it, the temperature is starting to flatten out a little, but still decline. One of the key things it's showing us is this is why 30 feet can make a big difference of this zone 2, of protecting you from that radiant heat. And that's when you got those big trees going up, big flames. Ideally, we don't have big flames next to your house. We'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes. But this kind of shows you why this 30 feet works, protecting from that radiant, how fast the temperature drop. And again, these temperature readings are within the fire, not away from the fire like it would be from your house. And in this zone, what we want to focus on is the right plants in the right places in the right conditions. And this is just your typical yard and garden. A lot of people already have part of this around the house. A lot of times they don't have all 4 sides. They usually have some type of yard, some type of flower bed around their house to help that will actually is beautiful and actually will help protect their home from that radiant heat. And this is step 2 that people do after they do that zone 1, or trying to protect your home from the ember, be ember aware. One thing about plants, there's no such thing that a plant that won't burn, but some will burn with less intensity than others. And here's a did you know question. Are native plants always the safest choice for fire escaping? The answer is actually no. Some native plants are designed to burn very rapidly in a wildfire. This is an excellent plant guide, a good starting point on plants to use around your home. You can actually download and print it yourself, or purchase it from these web links here. And a couple things on plants. We don't always talk about specific plants. We talk about the characteristics of fire-resistant plants. Plants that are good to use around your home do not accumulate a lot of dead vegetation. They have an open, loose branching. Some plants get oily or waxy layers. So we want something that doesn't get oily or waxy layers that burn hotter. And they don't have actually a lot of stuff to burn. So a low volume of vegetation. And generally, they will have a high moisture content. So they stay fairly moist. And so they are harder to burn because they're moist. Ideally, they're slow growing. Faster growing plants accumulate more fuel, more stuff to burn. The more of these characteristics the plant has, the more likely it's to be less harmful when it burns around your property. And a lot of our common flowers and garden plants do qualify for this. I got a couple of quick examples I'm going to share with you. This is just one of our native service berries. Very nice plant, very beautiful plant, and actually is good for wildlife critters. Another native plant, I'm just focusing on a couple of natives here, is chokecherry, which makes great jam, great for wildlife habitat, and is another good plant to think about. This one, arborvitaes, is a poor choice. This is, we call them little gas cans in the firefighting world. They have a lot of dead material inside. It's very oily. They kind of explode with gas cans, and ember can easily start them on fire. These, as firefighters, we just hate. So trying to replace, if these are in that zone 1, get rid of them. If they're in zone 2, look at replacing them over time, especially the ones close to your house. As we look at zone 2, one question I has, did you know, can the heat from a wildfire be high enough to ignite the furnishing in your house through the glass windows? The answer is yes. Believe it or not, if you have a lot of radiant heat, it could come through your glass and start your drapes on fire, your carpet on fire. I saw one house back in the early 90s. He had scorch marks on his carpet for the radiant heat coming through his glass. He had done quite a few of these steps and did not lose his house. So he recovered quickly. He had $30,000 damage. He had done some steps. And so his recovery, again, was very, very quick. So he was very appreciative of the efforts he had done to reduce the impact of wildfire around his home. So the key thing in this zone 2 is having the right plant, the right species, also having the right place and the right condition. And when I talk about right plant, right place, right condition, a couple examples. I just like to show this one because it's a great plant, it's just the wrong spot under a power line. Putting big trees under a power line is a classic example of the right plant in the wrong place. And we laugh at this, but think about what you're doing around your home. Are you doing something similar? These could have been the right plants. They could have been the right place, but they're in currently the wrong condition. They aren't being maintained. They're dying. So these plants now are no longer a good choice for this location right here. This is just an example of some good choice of plants. They're in nice, they're low growing, they're in great condition, they don't have a lot in the right place for what he's doing. So just a nice example of some right plants, right place, right condition. And I really like this picture. They have a nice rock next to the home and some plants outside of it surrounded by a yard. Really nice, pretty zone right next to the home, plus that zone 2 outside of that improved flower bed. So this is kind of what zone 2 is, just your yard and garden, at least 30 feet. And don't forget your outbuildings. A lot of people don't take care of the outbuildings. And that they're very valuable as well. And one last thing to think about where in zone 2 is what I call wicks. What I'm looking for is something that will carry fire through that zone. You might have a great yard like this gentleman, but he has a wooden fence. Okay, that wooden fence connects to the house, and you can't really see from the picture, but this wooden fence is next to the forest land. So the wooden fence can actually start on fire because fire can burn up to it. It will be a wick burning down the fence, and it connects to the house. And you can see there, to break that chain, they could just replace this chunk there with metal, or maybe replace the gate with a metal gate to break that wick. And that's kind of zone 2, is protecting your home from that radiant heat. Now let's start about your unimproved property. That's the forest land. That's the stuff Paul was talking about, your trees. And here, we're trying to reduce the energy. We don't want those high severity fires. We want low severity fires here. We often see these pictures of mega fires, big, huge flames around your homes. What we're trying to do is reduce the energies from these high severity fires to flame lengths like this. These are still, some people consider big flames. Yeah, they are. But the amount of damage to your forest can be simply less. It's called a low severity fire. 2, flame lengths like here on the picture on the right, firefighters can now put out with air resources, with dozers, even with direct attack with water. That picture on the left, when flames get that big, our air assets aren't even any good there. You can't get enough water on a big flame like that to do any good. And so we're trying to get that low severity fire again. So you have less trees dying. As Paul alluded to, he said 20% death of crown death scorching, where on that left, you lose all your trees. So trying to reduce that impact so you can get back to your property, get back to normal quickly. And we kind of call this defendable space. And as we look at this zone, 100, maybe 200 or 300 feet away, we're kind of looking at that dense vegetation. And is there dense vegetation there? If we do, we want to create some separation. We want to create some of those gaps in the forest again. You can leave some patches, but we want to create some gaps in the forest. This is just a ponderosa pine stand, very typical in eastern Washington. And so we're looking at that dense vegetation, whether it's shrubs, trees, big or small, looking at targeting them and removing some of that density. And getting some of those, you see those gaps in the skies. I call them roads of skies. Just trying to get some crown separation. So fire cannot easily go from tree to tree to tree. And so we can isolate those fires when trees die, just a group of trees. And so we kind of talk about is at least 5 feet between those branches. Try to get some separation. We call roads in the sky. Wider is better. 5 feet is what we feel most people can tolerate the first time they do this. If you do it wider, it's better. And clumping is those patches that Paul talked about. And we're now talking about a very small scale. Paul was alluding to the regional level, the landscape level. I'm now talking about your private little home, whether it's 5 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres. A clump could be 5 trees together, 10 trees together. And I look at them as one big tree. Does that clump have gaps around it? So when that clump does burn, will it spread to the rest of my forest? As a forester, I call that variable density thinning. That other word we heard today is patches and gaps is another concept. And as we look at doing this work out there, we're also looking at the tree species. Paul talked about soil species. Those are the species that come in after disturbance, those first species in the landscape. The best trees to leave out there from a fire standpoint is ponderosa pine and western larch. Okay, they get thick bark. The chance of surviving fire is higher because they have that thicker bark, and they're actually use less water and nutrients than some of our other species, so they can survive maybe drier conditions better. And these are great choices. A fair to good choice is Douglas fir. It does get thick bark. It just takes a little longer to get that thick bark than the other species. And so it's not a bad choice as well. And a lot of people like Douglas fir. And I use two names because all our trees have multiple names. I just try to use some of our common names here. So as we talked about thinning the trees, we had that dense forest and that ponderosa pine. This is what a thinning could look like afterwards. Opening the things up, creating some gaps. There's a little patch in the center with a lot of gap around the outside. And one of the things I like to share people, my forester side of me, is what does a tree think of this? This just shows you what trees think of all those tree removal. This came from a place in Spokane, a homeowners association. They thinned to reduce the impact of wildfire, to reduce catastrophic wildfire. And before the thinning, it was taking 14 years for that tree to grow 1 inch. After the thinning, it took 4 years to grow 1 inch. Some people ask, well, why did they cut the tree down 10 years later or 14 years later? Reason is they said, we didn't listen to you well enough, guy. We should have cut more trees the first time. And that's very common for people not to cut enough trees the first time. It's hard for people that drastic change of the landscape. So that's why we at least 5 feet, if not more. The second time around, they went 10 feet between the branches of the trees to really get some separation of the trees and to really reduce the impact of crown-to-crown ignition. And so this thinning of the trees to reduce the fire hazard also has a lot of benefits for making the health of the trees. We have another bark beetle here, picture, some spruce budworms, and so it helps reduce the impact of wildfires. So tree thinning is one of the things. Another thing we look for around your home to do to reduce the impact of fire getting your trees is what we call ladder fields. So what are ladder fields? Ladder fields are when fire starts in the grass, the pine needles, start growing some small shrubs, small trees, and they kind of act up and they just climb up to the crown of the trees like these slides showed you. This is an example around home, dead branches at the bottom of the ground, could be green branches. So a lot of what we call ladder fields. So this is for a tree. And when we're looking at ladder fields, we're looking again, trees, branches, small bushes that can cause fire to get to those tree crowns and start those branches on fires. And we're looking at removing those or trimming those ladder fields and removing them. People ask, well, how much should I do? Generally, we recommend at least 10 feet high. And that's typically what you can reach without a ladder. But one of the things for the health of the tree, not more than leave half the tree green. So if it's a 12-foot tall tree, only prune it 6 feet. It just means you'll have to prune it again later in a couple years as the tree grows. And along roads, if you can go 14 feet high for the fire trucks to get in, that'd be great. It's just a picture of a fire truck. You can see how big they can be. And so having that 14 feet really makes things look different. And that prior slide, this is kind of what it looks like afterwards. So a lot of people like the way it looks after they do this work. It increases the beauty, increases the view, and it's really helpful to people when they do this work. The key thing is regular maintenance on it. That's very, very helpful. You got to maintain it and keep it going. And one of the questions I had sent to me earlier and I said to add is slashable. How do we do this work? A couple things is, of course, the chainsaw, cutting the trees down. And one of the ways some people will take care of that material they cut is we call lop and scatter it. They just chunk it up in small pieces and spread it out. This is not something I recommend when we're talking that first couple 100 feet around your structures. Those are the critical zone to protect your home from fire. Okay, if you're out in the woods, you're 500 feet from anything, this could be something you do because it's very efficient and economical. The downside of this, you don't get that fire protection right away because it takes a while for that slash to decompose and those red needles fall to the ground. You do get the forest health benefits very quickly, but that field reduction or changing the intensity of fire will take a little more time. Another way is mechanically doing it what we call a masticator. This machine actually cuts the tree down. It has a 5-foot drum head on it that turns, and it will cut the tree down, push it over, and scatter it out in chunks. And this is another way that people do it, especially when they're trying to really reduce the chance of stuff burning and reduce intensity. And afterwards, this doesn't give us much. The ground fuel is really gone, and we get very low flame lengths from the ground fuels. Another way is cutting by hand and chipping. Very common method, just give you small chips. People are often asked about masking chipping. Well, is that adding fuel to the ground? One thing when we're doing this work, we're not actually really reducing the amount of fuel out there through these steps. What we're doing is changing how it will burn. Instead of having trees burning, we're compacting on the ground. So now instead of giving us 10-foot, 20-foot flames, it gives us 6 to 10-inch flames because it's so compact the ground. So we change how it burns. That's why this step works. From an ecological standpoint, we really haven't seen, studies haven't shown a lot of difference between masking and chipping. There are some concerns about chip depths, but it's pretty hard to get chips too deep to prevent stuff going through it. You'd have to have a really, really dense stand. Another way people do this work, hand cutting and pile and burning. This is another popular method. Homeowners do this themselves a lot because a lot of homeowners don't have chippers or masticators. It's another popular way that people can do this type of work. So there's a couple different ways to do this fuel reduction to create some of those patches and gaps in your woods. Leaving some down logs out in the woods is very good for critters. That down logs is part of the landscape. And so leaving some down logs on the landscape is fine from a fire spread standpoint. Now this kind of, as we start wrapping things up, I'd like to do a couple slides here to see what you think. And this is a typical homeowner. And if you notice, I said, what should we do with that pine tree? Cut or leave it? One thing I think we can all agree, if that pine tree is on fire, my house is in trouble. But one of the questions I always like to ask is, how will that pine tree in my deck catch on fire? Well, it'd probably start on fire because the deck's on fire. The deck will generate enough heat for that tree to start on fire. When my deck starts on fire, what else am I going to lose? My house. Okay, so how's my deck going to start on fire? The grass is touching wooden parts of the deck. So my real priority here isn't that big pine tree. It's those fine feels, that first 5 feet, when ember can land on it and start that grass on fire, which can start my deck on fire, which can start that tree in my house on fire. So the really priority here is trying to look at as where's my weakest link, where's my priority. And in this scenario, the best bang for your buck for this homeowner is to work on creating that first 5 feet zone around his home and not worry about that pine tree. And obviously this homeowner loves that pine tree because they built a deck around it. So it's very important to him. And I like to go back to my campfire scenario here is that those grasses are the tinder. That's step one. And that easily ignites, starting the kindling, the deck on fire. And the deck starts that tree/house on fire. And so you had all 3 components there. So we're trying to break that tinder portion of it. Separate that out so that tinder can't get that deck on fire. Here's another picture here about some trees that are pruned. Those trees are deer pruned. That's deer height pruning, not homeowner. And should we cut or leave those there? Let's look a little closer. That's a lot. These are arborvitae, or that thuja I mentioned earlier. And so we call these little gas cans. But look at all that dead material there. That's that tinder. It can easily ignite that kindling, all that green branches, more dead. Start the whole tree on fire. Start the whole house on fire. And so this is one of those things. Definitely should be removing these things and replacing with something that's less of a hazard around their home. And don't forget, embers can travel a mile. And so this could be in the city limits and be still a potential risk from a wildfire. My last picture I'm showing you is about this tree. Should we cut or leave it? Kind of reminds me of the deck scenario. A couple things I look at here. I look at the siding of the house. Brick siding. Nice green around it. So, fire's not going to easily get to it. The question is what kind of tree is it? Does that matter? This tree is a cedar tree. And so actually, cedar bark starts more on fire easier from an ember than ponderosa pine. And so I'd be wondering about this tree more. So this is kind of a questionable one. We need a little more information. Think about this one a little more harder, whether or not this tree should be removed or not. So I was just trying to put this one as a thoughtful thing. One of the things is, so that's kind of those steps we can do around the house. And zone 1 is being ember aware, making sure nothing that ember can land on. Zone 2 is trying to make it lean, clean, and green, so that radiant heat is far enough away from your house so it doesn't start on fire. And then zone 3 is where we're out working in the woods. We're creating some patches, a lot of gaps in the trees, in our shrubs, so fire can't go from tree to tree as easily or shrub to shrub as easily. We're trying to have a low severe fire there instead of that high severity fire. So we're trying to reduce the fuel loading, reduce the flame lengths out there, so we'll do less damage to our property and increase the chance of home surviving. A couple things to think about is evacuation plans. Know when to evacuate, know when to leave, get out of there when you still have time. Having a kit's very important. If you're trying to work with the neighborhoods, Firewise USA is a great site, firewise.org, the great site of information on getting your neighbors working together. And so what can you do as an individual? Believe it or not, there's help out there. DNR, we do actually site visits. We can walk around people's home, give a risk assessment, steps you can do around your house. If you have a lot of those small trees that are overstocked, like some of those pictures has, or like this picture shows, we actually in a lot of areas have grants in Eastern Washington that help pay for the part of the cost on your private land. So it help your landowner get some of this work done. And people ask, well, how do I get more information? And I will be posting this information in the chat, but you can call either a DNR or a Northeast or Southeast office for information. And if you get the wrong office, don't worry, they'll get you the right office. You tell them where you live. They're nice people, answer the phone. The biggest thing is working together, we can reduce your risk. And so it's working together to reduce the impact of wildfire so that your homes, your property has a chance of surviving. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Guy. That was a really good presentation. So far, I haven't seen anything pop up in the chat. I do have a couple questions from beforehand, but feel free to write them in. At this point, I'll just kind of run through questions, but we have pretty much wrapped up for the evening. Again, this will be recorded and will be on YouTube. So, Guy, can you speak to both DNR's effort to reintroduce fire onto the landscape and what steps could a landowner take, and then also what is holding back a landowner from reintroducing fire themselves on their landscape?
Basically, for homeowners reducing wildfire, one of the things is there's several groups working together: DNR, the Nature Conservancy, the Washington RC&D, and the Prescribed Fire Council, trying to bring fire back as a tool and specific for landowners. A couple of things is just training. We no longer have the expertise we used to, and they're doing a lot of training, getting the expertise back for people who can do it successfully. It's different than fighting fire. So that skill set out there. Two, but one of the things is liability. Working through process of if a landowner does this on the property and it burns the neighbor's property, what happens? So that's one of the things, is just that legal aspect of damage on a piece of property when you're doing underburn. And so they have doing some last couple of years some pilot projects of doing some underburn pilot projects. Several were supposed to happen this spring, one in Stevens County, but COVID put those on hold this year. So there are places moving forward trying to bring back prescribed fire as a tool for individual homeowners. The other thing is trying to get homeowners to work together. Doing it on your own 5 acres is very costly. If you can work together with get a bunch of landowners together, you bring the economy of scale down, you need less fire trail, and it really helps bring that cost down to bring that tool back. What was the other part of your question?
What DNR is doing to reintroduce on their property or land? I guess the state land.
I don't have a good answer what we're doing on our state lands. I know there's been discussion. Some of the challenges the same as I just mentioned there, the liability part. Historically, the large landowners used to do fire as a site prep tool. which is getting ready to plant trees. And now we're trying to change that for this prescribed fire is more ecological tool. And so one of the challenges for large landowners sometimes is just the prescribed fire can sometimes damage some of the crop trees because of the landowner's goal maybe to harvest trees for revenue production. And so large landowners sometimes have a challenge introducing fire from an ecological standpoint because it kills trees. Even a low severity fire can kill up to 20% of your trees, and that's just revenue for the large landowners. So it goes back sometimes to the landowner's goal, whether fire is a good tool for them, or if they should use a mechanical means to, like chainsaws or massacators or some other tool to mimic fire.
Olga had a really good question here. So with the current situation of fires, it seems like we're all kind of chasing our tails to reduce understory fuels. There's so much fuel out there, and landowners can only thin so many patches given time and economic constraints. But large fires seem to persist. Do you have any comments, and this is kind of open to both Paul and to Guy, what's going to be the next leap forward to really help at that large landscape scale to get everybody, on the ball, get the ball rolling?
I can talk briefly from the DNR standpoint at the 10,000 foot level. Recently, the DNR has developed the 20-year forest health strategic plan, which is trying to look at that very concept of trying to work on a landscape level. And they do have a couple pilot projects that we're going to be working on in the next couple of years, trying to connect those dots of trying to do it on a landscape level. And if people want more information, they go to our website and see that strategic plan. And so that's one of the things that's going on for the private land side as well as state lands. I'm not sure about the federal side.
Paul, can you speak to I don't know if you're still in this presentation, can you speak to the relationship of climate change, the fact that it's going to get hotter? I mean, is this kind of a lost cause? I mean, I hate saying that because I think, as humans, we're very creative and ingenious people. What can we do to prepare ourselves for the future?
So yeah, I'm still here. Thanks for the question, Olga. The climate change is going to double, triple, or quadruple, depending upon the climatic zone that you're in. Wildfire burned area, that is the area that's burned from 2000 till today, is going to double or triple, all right? And if you look at the amount of time that's elapsed for understories to fill in and for canopies to become dense, there isn't a panacea for getting out of this fast. The key is going to be to do the kinds of strategic forest health projects that Guy was talking about. And my lab has been working with the folks from the DNR for quite some time. And we actually developed some of the tools for the forest health projects that are going on. But one of the real keys is to identify the places where you can really change fire flow on the landscape and basically reduce flame length. So you increase the horsepower of fire suppression along with other tools. We're putting out all of the best fires that could do work on the landscape. And so promoting and allowing ignitions, especially away from WUI, where they can do some work for us, especially if they're natural, not human started. That'll allow us to be able to get some thinning, understory thinning, during these low to moderate fire weather days. Where it's close to WUI, that's not an option. Where the conditions are really, really dense and everything's going to crown out, that's not an option. But there are a lot of places where we can do that. There are a lot of places where we can do more prescribed burning. And so we've got to be able to address the smoke management conditions so we can make more good smoke and reduce the amount of smoke that's actually has worse PM 2.5 emissions. The understories are a really big problem, part of the problem. And these, we've recently completed some analyses for another publication showing that the increase in basal area in trees in Douglas fir, immature Douglas fir and grand fir is really quite spectacular in eastern Washington. And these are the trees that filled in over the last 100 years. So there's some opportunity to get some money for your trouble while you're reducing the problem and leaving the larger fire tolerant trees. So managed wildfire, coupling that with thinning and burning and prescribed burning where you can, those are really going to be the keys to getting that work done. And smoke management's an issue, so making political headway on smoke management is going to be a super more important key. And creating a buy-in from the health community that prescribed smoke is less smoke and it's healthier smoke than the wildfire. So I think all these things are part of the job.
I got one for you, Guy. And you kind of alluded and slash skipped around it, but are there specific plants to recommend that are good for privacy walls? I know a lot of landowners really like having the cypress plants, the arborvitae as screens for their property, but you just said that these are highly flammable and not good for planting. Is there something that you personally have seen that's really worked, or a landowner you've encountered who has come up with an idea that you think may be resilient to high ember output?
So did it say in the question, is this in zone 1 or zone 2 or outside of that area? This is kind of
I'm kind of making the question up, but I would assume that this is mostly going to be in zone 2, because I mean, we do see some along the house, but the ones I particularly think of are people planting 30 to 100 feet. So actually even a little bit of zone 3 outside to kind of block, especially along their driveway or along their property line.
Actually, some of our native trees. Douglas fir is not a bad choice. The difference with Douglas fir and those arborvitaes, it doesn't accumulate all that dead mulch underneath. And Douglas fir will often have some thicker branching and needles than larch or pine. Larch is a great choice, but it's not a good screening choice because A, it loses needles and it doesn't have a lot of that needles to give you that screen. Ponderosa pine can work as long as it's getting enough sunlight for the needles to stay. If the needles get too much shade, the branches die. So I'd look at a couple of those. I've also seen some people, if they have water resources, use some of our poplars, some of the hybrid poplars like you see out in the windbreak poplars that farmers use. I've seen people use some of those for screening because again, but they do require supplemental watering. So there's no great perfect answer. You kind of got to look at the situation and balance it out.
For landowners that are looking to go out and select trees and cut them down, good question for both speakers. In these thick forested areas, is it better to exclusively select for large trees? Do we want to kind of leave a variety? And what's the quantity of these small, medium, and large? We'll just kind of simplify the sizes there to leave on the property. And how would you leave them?
I'll take a start on that. Christy, can you tell us what kind of forest type that we're talking about? Where are you located? What sort of forest type? Is it dry pine, dry mixed conifer, moist forest? Are you still with us? If it's dry mixed conifer, then you're wanting a so pine and Douglas fir, you're going to want to favor the larger, medium and large sized trees on the landscape, favor removing the younger trees and trying to space them out in clumps and gaps, kind of like I showed you on that one slide. And you're going to create some slash. So you're going to want to create some small burn piles and burn those piles. A lot of folks will do it when you got snow cover on the ground. They'll throw some visqueen over them, pull it off, ignite the pile in November, December, and they'll do a few piles at a time, burn them up. If you've got a bigger acreage, you need more hands and you need to probably do some pile burning and broadcast burning. If you're in the moist mixed conifer, a lot of those conditions have a coarser clump and gap sort of texture. And so you're going to want to create small holes in the canopy. And again, favor the larger trees and deal with the slash. There'll be more slash in that situation.
I'll quickly jump in and just say when we do talk about broadcast burning and underburning, I would always preface by saying, please consult with a burn specialist or with your consulting forester before taking on an operation like that. As it was stated earlier, this liability, we've not quite figured it out, and it still does pass back to the person that started the fire.
Doesn't the state require someone with burn boss qualifications and lighting boss qualifications to do it anyway?
Guy, can you speak to that?
I don't really know the specifics. I know they're still developing a lot of those criteria, so I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Well, are there any other questions? I'm looking through the chat. I don't see anything. Oh, there is one here. With the change in fire regimes, we now see, how will wildland firefighting change in the future? It's kind of an ambiguous question, but I think this could have some merit to it.
This is Guy. That's a good question. I'm not sure if I can give you a good answer yet. How it will change on larger fires.
What we're seeing is that fires are getting bigger, and they're getting bigger faster because we're having more windy days. And when you have flame lengths that are over a few feet in length, direct attack falls apart, and so everything you fall back to interact. The best action literally is not in reaction, it's in proaction. It's making conditions over a significant enough area where you've actually managed the conditions for shorter flame lengths, so you have more opportunities for direct suppression, direct attack, or for allowing a fire to be able to do some work because you know what the flame lengths are going to be, and you have opportunities to hook, hold, and burn a fire. So the reaction, our opportunity to react wisely is shrinking, and our opportunity for proaction is increasing in importance. Doing the work before the outbreak of fire.
Great. Paul or Guy, if you know any of the research, can you guys speak to anything that's been done to look at the impacts of fire on soil quality? I know a lot of species, especially lodgepole pine, they rely on the scarification of soil following a burn to open up that seed bed and the heat to release their cones onto that residual seed bed. But what does it do, and at what point do we see a fire that's too intense actually begin to create problems for the soil?
So in mixed severity fire and in high severity fires, we see a variety of soil effects. An awful lot of the effects are related to whether or not the duff and the litter layers are deep and well cured, and whether accompanied by a lot of thick woody debris. And those conditions where you get deep consumption of duff and litter, you get a lot of energy release over a long time frame, and you can get sterilized soils where you literally burn the organic matter out of those soils. Those fires often result in what we call water repellent or hydrophobic soils. And heavy rain events or fast runoff events often lead to debris flows and shallow mass failures and landslides under those particular conditions. If the fuels are treated so you don't get that long burning time and intensity, you'll oftentimes see those soil severity effects decline. There's actually quite a bit of work done by our Rocky Mountain Research Station, Pete Robichaud, and a number of his colleagues. If you're interested in digging a little deeper, I can give you some references and you can go exploring.
Have we seen any success in opening up the litter and duff layer around trees in an effort to preserve scarring on the bark or killing of the roots underground, especially in shallow rooted species?
Shallow and deep-rooted species, we've seen quite a bit of success. So in an awful lot of our dry mixed conifer forests, and even in some moist mixed conifer forests on drier sites, where we still got some pretty good sized larch or ponderosa pine or big Doug fir that we're trying to protect. Very often, not only will they do thinning, pile burning, some broadcast burning, but prior to the broadcast burning, they'll actually rake the duff and litter away from the bases of the large trees that they're trying to protect, because it can be a foot and a half thick. And even with broadcast burning, if that ignites under really dry conditions, it can really do damage to trees you're trying to retain. So in that particular instance, to protect trees that are really important that you want to keep for a long time, it's actually being practiced by the Forest Service in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington both.
And a question for Guy: when there's a fire that is approaching your house, especially a fire that is probably a high severity fire, and I would initially say that the first thing you should do, and this was a question that came from Christy, is evacuate, especially if it's a high severity fire. But if they could do something as a last ditch effort, say to turn their sprinklers on, hose down their roof, is there any last ditch effort that could be done by a landowner to help preserve structures?
The biggest, to me, the easiest last ditch effort is that being ember aware, of focusing on what embers can land on around your home. Sprinklers are limited mainly because of problem with sprinklers in a wildfire like that is power is usually not available. And so the wells aren't working. And so that's kind of focused more on those aspects of things that embers can land on and doing that. If you have wells, if you have power still going, sprinklers could help alleviate that if you have them prior set up. The other challenge with sprinklers is just pressure. People don't have enough pressure to actually have sprinklers on all four sides of the house. And so it's really being ember aware would be my primary focus. And then maybe if you have the capacity, doing what I call the direction of the fire is trying to do something there. But that'd be second priority compared to being ember aware.
And what about possibly digging a burn line around your property? Have you seen success in that?
If it's high intense fire, it's just like no. A high intense fire will skip roads. If it's a low intense fire, yes. And so this is where if the homeowner had done some of that treatment ahead of time, and so they see a high intense fire is coming, but they know it'll probably reduce intensity. We've seen this work where homeowners have done some of this work last year. The fire was very high intense and it hit the area the landlord treated and dropped to low intensity. And then the fire trails that were dug around the home worked. And so for a fire trail to work, it needs some assistance for it's not a high severity fire. So it could work. It depends on what type of fire will be there when it gets near the home.
Oh, I have a question for you. I was at a landowner's property today, and they were planting white pine on their land. And I know that tree has struggled considerably in recent times and probably historically with blister rust. And we see that a lot of blister rust comes in on those lower, smaller branches. Do you think that maybe a historical level of fire on the landscape would have mitigated and maintained a low density of blister rust by reducing lower limbs?
Oh, that's a fun question. It's been introduced to the whole of the U.S. since the 30s. Western white pine is it's regenerated. It's a fire regenerated species in moist mixed conifer forests, from the red fir zone to the white fir zone, grand fir zone, and even in some cooler moist types on the west side. But until it gets quite old, it's got a pretty thin bark. And so my folks have a lake property up in northern Minnesota where they've got some huge eastern white pine and some small ones. And growing up, I did the branch pruning for them. And over time, we pruned out the blister rust cankers from branches, so they never got any bole cankers that created top killing. And so if you've got a handful of trees, you can do that to protect them on a property. We did it for 45, 50 years. But operationally, fire is rough on eastern and western white pine. It's rough on sugar pine until it gets a bark, and it gets a heck of a thick bark when it gets older. But it's not fire loving, it's not fire adapted in a lot of the ways that we think of. It just needs fire to regenerate. So you'll see it in the early part of the year where there's a feed source available, and you can keep it free of the blister rust with lower branch pruning the first 6-7 feet, and then higher crown pruning individual branches when you see them flagged. That's about what you can do.
Hey, I want to go to a question just posted about barricade fire retardant. I believe that's the stuff that landowners talk about that they spray on the home for the homeowner. I don't have any direct knowledge. I have an indirect knowledge of someone in the Carlton complex, 2015 Okanagan complex that had used it, and their house made it. Again, you need water, you need a pump, you need electricity to use it. But it's what basically it's a retardant you spray on your house, and it stays there. It's like a foam barrier, and you got to spray it on your house, and it helps put that barrier retardant around it, like gel. It almost looks like bubbles. And the nice thing about it is if it dries out, but it can be easily refreshed with a spray, like from a fire truck. So I have talked to someone who talked to someone, so it's secondhand that they had used it successfully in 2015. Yeah.
How we doing, Sean? We still going here?
Looks like I was muted. There we go. You caught me on that one. Okay, so I'll start my question over. So Rose Richardson here was speaking about the invasive species impact on wildfire or vice versa. And I know you can speak to this, Paul, but I wanted to actually initially bring up cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, something that an old professor of mine, Ben Zamora, or Dr. Benjamin Zamora would talk about, this kind of introduction of this invasive grassland species. And then as cattle grazing, specifically cattle grazing that was too intense. So we don't want to point the blame entirely at that, but mismanagement of it would ultimately remove the native species and create a system where cheatgrass was able to succeed. And once it had a foothold in the system, then we would see that the fire regime for that system would increase, actually, that it would burn more repetitively. And when that happened, then the soil would continue to just promote invasive species, which were annual species, instead of our long-lived perennial bunch grasses. And from that, I know that invasives in the grassland specifically have taken off. Paul, can you speak to anything in the forest land?
In terms of cheatgrass?
Not just cheatgrass, but any invasive species?
Yeah, there's a variety of them. A colleague of mine, Becky Kearns, has done a lot of really cool work on the east side, and I can share a number of references that talk about the effect of severe burning in dry forests, the coupling of that with sheep and cattle grazing where stubble height wasn't managed, that sort of thing. The key seems to be trying to constrain existing populations and with sound management not allowing them to grow more extensively. As you know, when we change the native grasses for things like cheatgrass, we're literally changing the fire regime. It's a hard beast to get rid of once it starts.
One question that I didn't get the chance to get to, but somebody had asked what the fire history of Stevens County, and I would expand the question more to the Colville National Forest. And Paul, you actually mentioned that somebody in your lab was working on this. I quickly dug up the Colville Plant Association group, and they discuss briefly the fire history. They talk more about the Northern Rockies, which is, you know, a very broad area. And so I would just say to that really what they wrote mimicked what Paul had talked about today, these very similar ecosystems of the dry pine and the mixed conifer, and some areas that were more dense, and that really, really dense mesic mixed conifer area that likely would have burned at a high severity, but we largely would have still seen the same pattern that we would have seen in the mixed conifer and the dry pine systems of the Eastern Cascades and the Blue Mountains. Paul, can you speak to any of the work? I don't know if it's still too early on that, that we're finding in the Colville.
No, actually, we've done, a lot of folks have actually done work on the Colville area, and I know the Stevens County area pretty well. I fish each year up in the upper Columbia above Northport, and on that wild stretch below the Canadian border. And so I get a chance to drive through there. That's basically the Colville, Chewelah, Kettle Falls, Hunters Ferry, Fort Spokane country, and an awful lot of that. The concepts that I talked about today really apply in the dry, the moist, and the cold forests. When you start getting east of Stevens, so thinking about Meadowline Falls and Newport and all the way over to Sullivan Lake, and those areas are getting very much into the Idaho Panhandle types. A lot more of moist influence that you don't see in the Okanagan Highlands coming over the Kettle Crest. So the plant association guides that are really relevant to the Northern Rockies start to become more relevant to the landscape east of Stevens. So that Stevens County area, there's an awful lot you can do to deal with changes in overstory and understory of forest to change how fire is going to work that landscape. It very much applies there.
All right, well, I'm going to do one last check for questions, and I do not see any. So I want to thank everyone who's still in here for coming out tonight. Thank Dr. Paul Hesberg and Guy Gifford. They've really done a great job giving this presentation. They really helped me out with my first big program event. Keep your eyes out for future webinars. We're going to be doing all sorts of stuff. And with the current climate of the coronavirus, we're really going to be shifting the way we look at delivering our programs, at least over the next couple months, and just kind of playing things by ear. So we'll be making some announcement on the future of those coming up. So thank you everybody so much, and enjoy your evening and stay safe out there. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Patrick.